There is a kind of loneliness that only those who have faith know. A loneliness that comes not from the absence of people, but from the overwhelming presence of a God who always seems too far away to touch, too close to ignore, and you are there, suspended between the heaven that promises solace and the earth that offers only silence, and that specific loneliness, that feeling of being absolutely alone, even when you pray, even when you believe, even when you give yourself completely to faith, is something that Simone Weil has known more intimately than anything else in her short and devastatingly intense life. Have you ever woken up at 3 a.m. with a sinking heart, not because you've lost faith, but because faith doesn't ease the emptiness, because you still believe in God but God doesn't respond in the way you need, because you feel like you're screaming at a sky that remains terribly, unbearably silent? This is not the loneliness of those who have stopped believing. This is the much more brutal loneliness of those who continue to believe despite everything, of those who maintain faith, even when faith does not bring company, of those who pray, knowing that there may be no answer but pray anyway, because stopping praying would be like stopping breathing. Simone Weil lived 34 years on this planet and died of tuberculosis, aggravated by her refusal to eat more than the ration that the French under Nazi occupation received, a form of radical solidarity that her family called slow suicide, but which she understood as participation in collective suffering. And in that brief life, she experienced more forms of loneliness than most people can name in an entire lifetime. She knew the intellectual loneliness of being the only woman in rooms full of male philosophers who saw her as a freak. She knew the physical loneliness of headaches so severe they made her scream alone in her room. She knew the social loneliness of being Jewish at a time when to be Jewish was to be marked for extermination. She knew the mystical loneliness of having profound experiences of God that no one around her could understand or validate. But the deepest loneliness, the one that cut the deepest, was the loneliness of feeling God completely present and completely absent in the world. Same time. Do you know what that's like? Feeling that God is there, but in a way that doesn't alleviate the pain of your human finitude, that doesn't fill the hole inside your chest, that doesn't take away the feeling of being fundamentally alone in the universe, even when you believe with every fiber of your being that He isn't. It is the paradoxical loneliness of those who have faith but no comfort, of those who believe but are not sure, of those who love God but do not feel love in return in the way that a human heart desperately needs to feel. And if you're here now, if something in those words is touching an open wound inside you that you can barely admit exists, if you too know that specific and terrible loneliness of believing in God while still feeling absolutely abandoned, then subscribe to this channel now, because we're going to explore together a kind of truth that churches don't want you to know, that spiritual self-help books avoid mentioning, that Simone Weil had the brutal courage to look straight at without blinking. And you won't want to miss what comes next, because what she discovered about the loneliness of faith will validate something inside you that you thought was broken, but is actually just too awake to accept comforting lies. Most religious people live in fear of this loneliness, pretend it doesn't exist, bury it under layers of manufactured certainties and noisy communities and rituals that act as temporary anesthesia. But Simone Weil had no patience for pretense. She dove straight into the heart of this loneliness and discovered something that most will never have the courage to seek. Discovered that perhaps loneliness is not a failure of your faith, but proof that your faith is real, that you are not just repeating empty words, but actually touching something too vast to fit within human categories of company and presence. So tell me, do you also know this loneliness? Do you also wake up in the middle of the night feeling like God is too far away and too close at the same time? Do you also wonder if faith should bring more peace than this constant restlessness that doesn't let you rest? Before we go any deeper, I need you to know that I see you. I recognize this specific pain that you carry, and it is real. It is not spiritual weakness. It is not a lack of sufficient faith. It is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. The loneliness of those who believe in God but don't feel God the way they need to feel is one of the most legitimate and least recognized pains of the human experience, because everyone around you tells you that faith should bring peace, that prayer should bring companionship, that if you really believed, you wouldn't feel so terribly, devastatingly alone. But Simone Weil understood something that few understand. She realized that this loneliness is not a bug in the spiritual system. It is a feature. It is not a failure of faith, but a necessary characteristic of any faith that is true and not just a comforting fantasy. Have you ever been to a church, temple, mosque, any religious space, and felt more alone there than when you were at home in silence? Have you ever tried to explain to someone in your faith community that you feel abandoned by God and seen that look of panic in their eyes, that urgent need to give you ready answers, to remind you that God is always present, to make you stop talking about this loneliness because it threatens the collective fantasy that faith solves everything? Simone Weil experienced this repeatedly. She had profound mystical experiences where she felt the presence of Christ so intensely that she cried for days. But these experiences didn't eliminate the loneliness. They just made it more complex, more paradoxical, because now she knew that God was there, but in a way that didn't work the way human companionship works. She wrote about this with a brutal honesty that scandalized many Christians of the time. She said that God is always absent from our earthly existence, not because God does not exist, but because God's presence is of a completely different nature from the presence that our bodies and minds desperately desire. It's like feeling hungry and having access only to abstract concepts about food. You know intellectually that food exists, but your stomach remains empty. Your body continues to cry out for something material, tangible, immediate, and faith offers you something real, but of a completely different order, from the order that would alleviate physical, emotional, psychological loneliness. Weil worked for months at the Renault factories in 1934 and 35, deliberately putting herself in the position of the most exploited workers, and there, she experienced a form of loneliness even more brutal, because in addition to the distance from God, she felt the indifference of the world, the social invisibility of someone who is just a number on the production line. And it was during this period that she understood something fundamental. She realized that the loneliness of those who have faith is amplified by the loneliness of those who are human in a world that treats humans as things. You know that double layer of loneliness? Feeling alone spiritually and also socially. Feeling that God is distant and that people are too. Feeling that you belong neither in heaven nor on earth. Most religions promise you community. They promise that when you enter the family of faith, you will never be alone again. But Simone Weil realized that this promise is often a well-intentioned lie, because religious community is often just a collective of people pretending together that they are not. Alone, it is a collective performance of certainty, where no one can admit doubt without being seen as weak or lost. She herself was never baptized, never officially entered the Catholic Church despite her deeply Christian mystical experiences, because she refused the lie that belonging to a religious institution would eliminate the essential loneliness of the human condition. And maybe you're feeling this right now. Maybe you're within religious community, but feeling more alone than ever because you can't be honest about your doubts, about your emptiness, about the fact that you pray and pray and pray, and God remains silent in ways that hurt physically. Weil would say that your solitude is more honest than the false companionship that most accept. That feeling alone in faith is a sign that you are truly seeking God and not just seeking social anesthesia. But that doesn't make loneliness any less painful, does it? Knowing that your pain is valid doesn't make it hurt less. Knowing that solitude is a necessary part of the genuine spiritual journey doesn't eliminate the desperate desire to feel less isolated, less abandoned, less completely and terribly alone in this all too vast universe. And I'm not going to lie to you and say that this pain will go away if you just pray more, meditate better, have more faith, because Simone Weil prayed intensely, meditated deeply, had faith that burned like fire, and yet lived in solitude that haunted her until her last breath. So clearly, it's not a question of doing the right things. It's a question of recognizing that perhaps loneliness is an inseparable part of being awake spiritually in a world that sleeps, of having real faith in a time, of fabricated certainties, of seeking God, who it completely transcends our human categories of presence and companionship. But to really understand what Simone Weil discovered about this paradoxical loneliness of those who have faith, we need to go deeper. We need to go beyond the recognition of pain and explore its layers, its roots, its implications. And I warn you right now that this will hurt more before it starts to make sense. Because Weil doesn't offer, it offers cheap solace, it offers naked truth, and truth always cuts before it heals. The first layer of this loneliness is the most obvious, but also the hardest to admit. It's the loneliness of talking to someone who never responds the way you need them to respond. Every human relationship works based on reciprocity. You speak, and the other person responds. You express need, and the other person tries to respond. You are present, and the other person recognizes your presence. But with God, all this falls apart. You speak, and there is silence. You express desperate need, and there is no tangible response. You are completely present in prayer, but God seems to be in a place you cannot reach. Simone Weil experienced this particularly intensely during bouts of headaches that began when she was 14 and never left her. Pains so severe that she described them as having destroyed her youth, made any sustained thought impossible, transformed each day into an exercise in survival. And she prayed. God, as she prayed, she begged for relief, for a minute of peace, for the ability to think clearly without each thought being interrupted by waves of pain that made her want to scream. But the pain continued. God remained silent, and she had to find a way to live with faith despite this deafening silence. Do you know this experience? To pray for something you really need, not a luxury, but a basic need like health, peace of mind, relief from suffering, and receiving nothing but more silence, more absence, more loneliness, amplified by the fact that you keep believing, but your belief doesn't change your reality? Most people at this point do one of two things. Either abandon faith by saying that God doesn't exist, because God who does exist would respond, or they bury the pain under layers of theology that explains why God doesn't respond, but neither of these explanations really touches the wound of loneliness. None of them eliminates the devastating feeling of screaming into the void, even when you believe that the void is not empty. Simone Weil refused both easy ways out. She continued to believe, but also continued to feel the loneliness without trying to rationalize it, without trying to turn it into something it wasn't. And it was in this refusal to run away or explain that she began to discover something profound about the nature of God and the nature of the divine presence. She realized that perhaps God does not respond because a response in the sense we want, a response that alleviates our immediate loneliness, a response that functions as human companionship, would actually be God's way of not respecting our freedom, our autonomy, our need to face naked reality without comforting mediations. It's as if God said through the silence, "I love you too much to give you the illusion of companionship. I respect you too much to pretend that divine presence functions as human presence. I believe in you enough to let you face the loneliness that all human beings must face if they are to grow beyond the childish need to be constantly reassured." But that doesn't make the silence any less painful, right? Knowing that God leaves you alone out of love does not eliminate loneliness. It only makes it more complex, more loaded with meaning, but also more difficult to bear, because now you can't even take refuge in the idea that God doesn't care. You have to live with the paradox of God, who cares so much that he refuses to give you the kind of presence you desperately desire. Weil developed a concept that she called attention to, which is a form of prayer that doesn't ask for anything, doesn't expect an answer, just observes reality, including one's own pain and loneliness, with total clarity, without trying to change or escape or explain. And she discovered that this kind of attention, this ability to look at loneliness without running away from it, creates space within you where something unexpected can happen. Not solace, but transformation. Not companionship, but a deep understanding that loneliness is perhaps a portal to a different kind of connection. And now, before we explore the second layer of this descent, I would like to pause and find out where you are watching me from now. In which part of this planet you are carrying this specific loneliness of those who have faith but no comfort, of those who believe but feel no less alone. Leave your city, your country in the comments, because there is something deeply comforting in knowing that at this very moment, around the world, there are souls like yours facing this same paradoxical loneliness, seeking the same answers that Simone Weil sought so intensely. And maybe together, we can create something it never had, a community of people honest about the loneliness of faith, instead of a community that pretends loneliness doesn't exist. So tell me, where do you watch us from? And as you write this, let's go down to the second layer, the loneliness of seek God who cannot be found through searching. Simone Weil realized something that goes completely against everything we were taught about spirituality. She realized that the more you actively seek God, the more you push God away, because seeking implies that you know what you are looking for and where to look for it. But God, by definition, completely transcends any concept or image or place that your mind can conceive. It's like trying to catch the wind with your hands. The more you close your fingers trying to hold on, the more the wind escapes. The only way to feel the wind is to open your hands completely and let it pass through you. But this requires the kind of surrender that goes against every human instinct for control and agency. Most spiritual practices teach you techniques, methods, steps to follow that supposedly bring you closer to God. And Weil was not saying that these practices are useless. She herself prayed intensely, read sacred texts obsessively, participated in rituals when allowed. But she understood that all these things were at best preparation. They were ways of creating space within yourself, but not ways of forcing God to appear in that space. God comes or doesn't come completely by grace, by movement that doesn't depend on your effort, and you can't do anything but wait without knowing if the wait will be rewarded. And this waiting without guarantee, this openness without certainty that something will fill it, is a form of loneliness, even deeper than the loneliness of talking to someone who doesn't respond. It's the loneliness of desperately wanting something that you can't earn, can't deserve, can't achieve through any effort of your own. And it goes against everything modern culture has taught us about self-determination and the ability to create our own reality through hard work and persistence. You can't win God. You can't convince God to show up. You can't make God love you more through better prayers or more virtuous living. And to recognize this is to recognize a fundamental impotence that modern humans hate to admit. Simone Weil worked in factories and saw workers repeating mechanical movements hour after hour, day after day, bodies transformed into extensions of machines. And she realized that many spiritual practices work in the same way. You repeat mantras, follow rituals, perform meditative techniques as if you were a spiritual worker trying to produce enlightenment through hard work. But God is not a product that can be manufactured. God does not respond to effort in the same way that a machine responds when you press the right buttons. And so you sit there doing everything you've been told to do, praying the right prayers, living the virtuous life, practicing disciplined meditation, and still feeling that terrible emptiness, that absence that no practice can fill, that loneliness that doesn't lessen no matter how many times you go to church or temple or mosque or spiritual retreat. Weil would say that this solitude is necessary, that it is exactly the space that needs to exist for something real to happen. Because while you are full of your own efforts and techniques and active pursuits, there is no room for God to enter. You are too busy building stairs to heaven to realize that heaven is not a place that can be reached by stairs. She developed a concept she called decreation, which is not destroying oneself, but getting rid of the ego that thinks it can conquer God. It is dissolving the illusion that you can do something to deserve or achieve the divine. It is accepting that you are completely powerless and that all your spiritual search is ultimately a futile attempt to control what cannot be controlled. And this is not nihilism. It is not giving up. It is a much deeper form of openness where you finally stop placing yourself at the center of spiritual history and allow God to be God instead of being a projection of your needs. But living in this state of decreation, living knowing that you can do nothing to achieve what you most desire, is almost unbearable loneliness, because humans need a sense of agency. They need to feel that their actions matter, that their efforts make a difference. And here is Weil saying that in relation to what really matters, in relation to God, you are completely powerless, and you need to learn to live with that powerlessness without despair. Have you ever felt this? Have you noticed that all your spiritual practices, no matter how sincere they may be, do not bring you even 1 millimeter closer to God? Have you ever recognized that you can do everything right and still feel that terrible emptiness, that absence that no spiritual discipline can eliminate? Most people at this point either abandon the practice saying it doesn't work, or double down on the effort thinking they need to try harder. But Weil is suggesting a third way, which is to keep practicing but without expecting results, to keep praying but without demanding answer, keep searching but recognizing that you cannot find. You can only create conditions to be found, and even those conditions do not guarantee anything. It's like preparing a guest room for a guest who may never arrive. You arrange everything with care and attention, but you know that the guest will only come if they want and when they want. And there is nothing you can do to force the visit. And so you live in this indefinite waiting, in this readiness without guarantee, in this loneliness of someone who is constantly prepared for an encounter that may never happen. And this requires the kind of inner strength that few possess because it requires you to give up all need for control without giving up all sense of purpose. The third layer of this descent is perhaps the most brutal and also the least recognized. It is the loneliness of discovering that even when you experience God, even when you have those rare moments of divine presence that mystics describe, those moments do not eliminate the fundamental loneliness. They only make it more acute, more painful, because now you know what you are missing when God is absent. Simone Weil had 3 mystical experiences that she described in detail. The first was in Assisi in 1937, when she entered the chapel where St. Francis used to pray and was overcome by force that forced her to kneel for the first time in her life. The second was in Solesmes in 1938, during Holy Week, when her headache was so intense that every moment was agony. But through this agony, she felt the presence of Christ in such a real way that she cried for days. And the third was when she was reciting George Herbert's poem called Love, and she felt that Christ came down and took her completely. These experiences were real. They were transformative. They were moments of deep connection with the divine that she never forgot. But here is what no one tells you about mystical experiences. They pass, they go away. And when they go away, you are left with the memory of an intimacy that is no longer accessible, with a longing for a presence that you cannot summon through will, with an even bigger hole inside your chest, because now you know exactly what is missing. It's like a person who experienced deep and true love, and then lost that love. The loneliness after the loss is much worse than the loneliness of someone who never loved, because you have a point of reference. You know what it's like not to be alone. You can compare the current absence with the past presence, and the comparison is torture. Weil wrote about this with devastating honesty. She said that after the mystical experiences, she spent months waiting for them to happen again, praying with even greater intensity, doing everything she could to recreate the conditions that had allowed those encounters. But nothing worked. God remained absent, despite all her efforts. And she had to learn an even more difficult lesson than accepting God's absence. She had to accept that God's presence does not depend on her, cannot be controlled. By her, it does not happen because she deserves it, or because she does everything right. It happens by pure grace, and grace, by definition, cannot be conquered or predicted or controlled. So she lived in a state of constant waiting, always open to the possibility of a new meeting, but never knowing if or when that meeting would come. And this waiting with no end in sight is a form of loneliness that slowly erodes, because you cannot completely give up on hope, because you know that a meeting is possible. You have already experienced it, but you also cannot live in constant expectation because it prevents you from fully living the present moment. It's an impossible paradox to resolve. You need to be open without being expectant. You need to wait without demanding. You need to remember without getting stuck in your memory. Have you ever experienced this in a human context? Have you ever loved someone deeply, experienced connection that transformed you, and then that person left or died or simply stopped being available emotionally, and you were left there with a vivid memory of what it was like to be connected but without current access to that connection? The loneliness after having known intimacy is qualitatively different from the loneliness of someone who has never known it, because now you know exactly what you are missing. You can compare each moment of current isolation with past moments of connection, and that comparison is a knife that cuts again and again. With God, this is multiplied by infinity, because you are not just remembering a human connection that ended, you are remembering a connection with the divine that promised to be eternal but turned out to be intermittent. You are living with a literal longing for God, with a feeling of abandonment for those who supposedly never abandon, with the existential loneliness of those who touched the absolute but are now back to the relativity of ordinary human existence. And there is no medicine for it. There is no technique that will bring God back. There is no amount of prayer or meditation or good conduct that guarantees a new encounter. You simply have to live with the longing, with the memory, with the hole where God was and is no longer, at least not in a way that you can feel or recognize. Simone Weil spent the last years of her life in this state. She never had another mystical experience of the kind she had at Solesmes, or when reciting Herbert's poem. She lived with the memory of these experiences, but without access to them. And this did not make her any less devout. It did not lessen her faith, but it certainly deepened her loneliness, because now she knew with absolute certainty that God exists. That encounter is possible, but she also knew that this knowledge did not diminish in any way the current absence of God. It did not make the distance less painful. It did not fill the void that opened within her after the divine presence withdrew. And maybe you are experiencing something similar. Maybe you too have had moments where you felt something greater, where prayer stopped being empty words and became real dialogue, where you had glimpses of presence that completely transformed your understanding of reality. But those moments have passed, and now you are living in absence, in longing, in loneliness, amplified by the knowledge that connection is possible, but not available right now. Weil would say that this solitude is also grace, that it is also a form of divine love because it forces you to mature beyond the need for constant consolation. It forces you to develop the kind of faith that does not depend on feelings or experiences, but that persists through the dark night of the soul, through prolonged absence, through silence that seems to have no end. But knowing that solitude has purpose doesn't make it any less lonely. Recognizing that absence is pedagogical doesn't eliminate the pain of absence. And you still wake up in the middle of the night with an empty heart. You still pray, knowing that you probably won't feel anything. You still carry faith that doesn't bring comfort, but just demands more and more from you without offering tangible reward in return. But this brutal discovery by Simone Weil about the nature of solitude and faith is not disguised despair. It is not religious nihilism. It is something much more radical and much truer. Because what she saw at the depths of that loneliness, what she realized when she finally completely stopped fighting the absence of God, reveals something about the nature of human existence and divine presence that changes everything if you have the courage to look directly. The first dimension of this truth that can only be seen in the darkness of solitude is that God's absence is not a failure or punishment or a sign that you did something wrong. The absence is a specific form of presence. It is the way in which God respects your human freedom without violating it through a manifestation so obvious that it would eliminate the possibility of genuine choice. Simone Weil realized that if God were constantly present in a sensible way, if you always felt the divine presence as you feel the presence of another person in the room, you would not be free. You would be dominated by that presence. Your will would be absorbed by the divine will, not by choice, but by experiential coercion. It's like the difference between loving someone who is always by your side, watching your every move, and loving someone who gives you space to be yourself, to make decisions without constant supervision, to grow through mistakes that you can only make if you are genuinely alone. The loneliness you feel, that terrible feeling that God has abandoned you, is actually the ultimate form of divine respect. It is God saying through silence, "I trust you enough to leave you alone. I love you enough not to suffocate you with my presence. I believe in your ability to grow and mature spiritually even without, especially without, my constant intervention." Weil called this the impersonal love of God, which is not impersonal in the sense of cold or distant, but impersonal in the sense of non-possessive, non-controlling, not dependent on constant emotional reciprocity. It is love that allows complete autonomy to the beloved, even when that autonomy results in suffering, because God understands that without genuine autonomy, without the real possibility of being alone and making choices without divine coercion, you would never be truly free, and therefore never truly capable of genuine love in response. You are alone because God loves you too much to deprive you of the solitude that is necessary for real spiritual maturity. But this truth can only be seen when you stop fighting loneliness. When you completely accept absence without trying to artificially fill it with cheap consolations or manufactured certainties. When you live in solitude without resentment, without feeling abandoned, just recognizing that this is how it must be if you want to be truly human instead of a divine puppet. Will experienced this concretely during his work in factories. As she saw how workers were treated as objects, how the constant presence of supervisors and production demands eliminated any space for autonomy or human dignity. And she understood that if God acted in this way, if God were a heavenly supervisor constantly present and demanding, this would be a form of spiritual slavery, even if disguised as love. So God withdraws, God creates space, God allows solitude not out of indifference, but out of absolute respect for human dignity that requires genuine freedom. Can you see your loneliness in this light? Can you recognize that perhaps God's silence is not rejection, but present, not absence, but a different form of presence, not abandonment, but radical trust in your ability to exist autonomously? This does not immediately make loneliness less painful, but it begins to transform its meaning. It begins to reveal that you are not alone because you have been rejected, but because you have been honored. You are not abandoned, but liberated to be fully human, rather than eternally dependent on constant divine validation. The second dimension of the truth discovered in the darkness is that the solitude of one who has faith teaches something that no comforting presence could teach. It teaches the brutal but liberating distinction between the real God and human projections of God. Simone Weil realized that most people do not believe in God. They believe in an image of God that they constructed based on their psychological needs, their childish desires for protection and validation, their fantasies of a fair universe where good behavior is rewarded and suffering always has a comforting explanation. Loneliness kills these projections. The prolonged absence of God destroys all comforting fantasies, and what remains after all illusions have been burned is either nothing, total despair and abandonment of faith, or something much truer than what you had before, an openness to God that is not projection, that does not meet any of your expectations or needs, that completely transcends human categories of presence and absence, love and abandonment, response and silence. When you pray for years and don't receive the answer you expected, when you suffer intensely and God remains silent, when you do everything you've been told to do and still feel that terrible emptiness, you have two choices. You can conclude that God doesn't exist or doesn't care and abandon faith completely, or you can allow loneliness to destroy your childish God, your projected God, your God built in the image of your needs, and make room for something completely different, for God who doesn't work according to your human expectations. Well, experience this over and over again, each time she prayed for relief from her headaches and received no relief, each time she expected God to intervene in the world's suffering and saw only more suffering, each time she sought divine consolation and found only more silence. A layer of her projections about God was destroyed, a comforting fantasy was burned away, and what remained was truer, but also more difficult to bear. Because true God does not conform to human needs, does not answer prayers the way you want, does not prevent suffering just because you believe. True God is completely other, completely transcendent, completely beyond any concept or image your mind can form, and the only way to begin to relate to this God is to allow loneliness to destroy all your pre-existing ideas about what God should be like. It's a process too painful for most people to bear. It's easier to keep God domesticated, God who answers prayers when you pray correctly, God who functions as a heavenly protective father or cosmic therapist, always available to make you feel better. But Weil understood that this domesticated God is an idol. It's a psychological projection. It's not the incomprehensible God that really exists. Have you noticed this? Have you recognized that the God you say you believe in is actually a mental construct based on what you need God to be rather than what God actually is? Loneliness forces this perception because when your projected God does not show up to comfort you, when your prayers are not answered in the way you expected, when you continue to suffer despite all your faith and devotion, you have to choose between abandoning God completely or allowing your understanding of God to be completely transformed. Weil chose transformation. She let loneliness destroy all her illusions about God, and what she discovered on the other side was no longer comfortable, but was more true. It was God who cannot be manipulated through prayer or good behavior, who does not exist to satisfy human needs, who does not conform to human expectations of how divine should manifest. And strangely, when you ace, it is this God who does not comfort you, who does not respond in the way you want, who allows your solitude without intervening. You begin to develop the kind of faith that does not depend on feelings or rewards, faith that persists through the endless night. Faith that demands nothing in return, because you have finally understood that God is not an object that exists to satisfy your needs, but an absolute reality that completely transcends categories of useful or useless, comforting or not comforting. Is your loneliness teaching you this now? Are you destroying your childhood projections about God and making room for something more true, even if less comfortable? Will would say that this destruction is painful but necessary, that you need to lose the God you imagined to find the God who really exists, that loneliness is a tool that burns all illusions until only naked truth remains. The third dimension of truth in the darkness is perhaps the most paradoxical and also the most liberating. It is the discovery that the solitude of those who have faith can be transformed into sacred solitude, into the capacity to be alone that is no longer suffering but plenitude, no longer absence but presence of a completely different kind than you expected. Simone Weil would not call this grace in the traditional religious sense of reward for suffering. She understood grace as something that can only enter the void created by the complete acceptance of loneliness, as light that can only be seen when you stop fighting the darkness and allow your eyes to adjust to the darkness. She wrote about moments where, in the midst of the most intense pain and loneliness, something changed qualitatively. Solitude stopped being a prison and became a sacred space. The absence of God stopped being abandonment and became a specific form of presence that she could not explain in words, but that completely transformed the experience. It wasn't that loneliness disappeared or that God suddenly became present in a sensible way. It was that she developed the ability to inhabit solitude without being destroyed by it, to exist in the void without trying to fill it, to wait without despair, because waiting in itself became a deeper form of prayer than any prayer with words. Weil described this as learning to love at a distance, learning that true love for God does not require constant presence, but accepts absence as a necessary part of the relationship, just as you can deeply love someone who is physically distant without distance diminishing love. It just changes its form. But this is not something you can force or achieve through effort. It is transformation that happens or doesn't happen when you finally stop fighting, when you completely give up trying to control or understand or resolve loneliness and simply allow it to be what it is. Some people experience this transformation, this subtle but profound change, where loneliness stops being an enemy and becomes a companion, where the absence of God reveals itself as a paradoxical form of intimacy with God, where you discover that you can live fully, love deeply, find genuine meaning, even without constant religious consolation, even without comforting certainties, even in the loneliness that you thought would destroy you. Other people never experience this. They continue to live in solitude without transformation, without relief, without discovering a sacred dimension within the void. And Weil would be honest enough to admit that grace is not something that everyone receives in the same way or at the same time, that you can do everything right and still not experience this transmutation of solitude into solitude. But the possibility exists. The opening for this transformation is always there if you can remain in solitude without despair, without resentment, without completely closing your heart because of the pain. Have you ever had glimpses of this? Moments where the loneliness that normally crushes you suddenly becomes a space of deep peace, where you realize that being alone does not mean being abandoned, where you feel something that is not exactly the presence of God in the way you expected, but is presence anyway, a presence that fills the void, not by eliminating the void, but by inhabiting it together with you. These moments don't last. They go away as mysteriously as they came, but they leave a mark. They show that transformation is possible, even when it's not likely, that loneliness can contain within it the seed of something sacred, if you can endure it without breaking it through escape or denial. Weil lived the last months of her life in complete solitude, exiled from France, separated from her family, slowly dying of tuberculosis in an English sanatorium where no one really understood who she was or what she had been through. And there is no evidence that she had consoling mystical experiences during this final period. There are no letters speaking of God's comforting presence as she wasted away, but there are testimonies that she maintained an inner peace that surprised nurses, a deep acceptance of her situation that was not resignation, but something more like solidity, with the capacity to be completely alone without being destroyed by loneliness, to die without companionship, but also without despair. And perhaps that is all we can hope for, not a miraculous cure from loneliness, not a guaranteed transformation of suffering into ecstasy, but the possibility of developing inner strength to carry loneliness with dignity, to live with faith that does not bring consolation, but brings something perhaps more valuable, brings the ability to exist authentically even in absence, to love God even when God seems infinitely distant, to maintain openness to grace even when grace does not manifest itself in the way you desperately desire. And now, knowing all this, knowing that the loneliness of those who have faith has no easy solution, does not disappear through more prayer or better theology or a more welcoming community, what do you do with this brutal truth? How do you live day to day carrying faith that does not alleviate loneliness, believing in God who remains silent, maintaining hope without expectation that hope will be fulfilled? Simone Weil hasn't just philosophized about this. She's developed concrete practices, ways of being that don't cure loneliness, but make it possible to live with it without being consumed. And it's these practices that can make the difference between sinking into loneliness and learning to navigate through it while maintaining some form of spiritual integrity. The first practice is something that Weil called pure attention, which is the ability to look at your loneliness, your suffering, the absence of God, without trying to change anything, without seeking explanation, without demanding relief, just observing with total clarity what is. Every morning, before you do anything else, before you pick up the phone or start the day's tasks, sit for 10 minutes in silence and observe your loneliness. Internally name what you are feeling without judgment, without history, without trying to fix it, just direct recognition. Today, the loneliness is here. Today, God seems distant. Today, faith hurts more than it comforts, and you let it be true without needing to do anything about it. Weil understood attention as a form of love, as the ability to be completely present with what is without trying to possess or change. And when you practice attention to your own loneliness, you are essentially saying, I see you, I recognize you, I will not pretend that you don't exist. And this simple act of recognition without escape already begins to transform the relationship with loneliness, because now you are no longer being haunted by something you deny. You are consciously inhabiting the reality of your current state. The second practice is to keep praying even when prayer brings no comfort, even when you know you probably won't feel anything, even when every word seems to fall into the echoless void. You pray anyway, not because you expect an answer, but because prayer itself becomes a way of maintaining openness, of refusing to completely close your heart because of disappointment, of insisting on the possibility of connection even when connection seems impossible. Weil prayed intensely even during periods of God's total absence. She recited Our Father in Greek with complete attention to each word, not expecting it to change anything, but simply as an act of fidelity, as a refusal to give up completely, even when giving up seemed the only rational response to prolonged absence. You don't pray to get something. You pray to stay open, to train your ability to wait without demanding, to practice the kind of love that doesn't depend on immediate reciprocity. And over time, that prayer without expectation can become more profound than prayer that always expects a response, because it forces you to find value in the act of praying itself, rather than in the result that prayer is supposed to produce. The third practice is to seek beauty even in the midst of solitude, not as a distraction or escape, but as a reminder that reality contains both pain and splendor, both the absence and presence of something that transcends, and contemplation of beauty is a form of attention that can train you to the kind of openness that also allows you to see a sacred dimension within your own solitude. When loneliness is unbearable, when you feel like you are going to be crushed by emptiness, find something beautiful. It could be sky at dusk, music that moves you, poem that resonates with something deep within you, and give that beauty your full attention for 5 minutes, not analyzing, not trying to understand, just allowing beauty to exist within you along with pain, not denying either, not demanding that beauty eliminate pain, just recognizing that both are real and both have a place in the complete human existence. Weil saw beauty as experimental evidence that something transcendent can touch material existence without dominating it. Beauty completely captures you. It does not possess you. It transforms you, but it respects your freedom. And learning to relate to beauty in this way trains you to relate to God in a similar way, not demanding possession or control, but allowing presence that comes and goes mysteriously. The fourth practice is to write letters to your loneliness as if it were a person, acknowledging what it has taught you, giving thanks for the brutal truths it revealed, asking for strength to continue carrying it without being destroyed. And this is not a cheap therapeutic exercise, but a form of decreation where you recognize that loneliness is not your enemy, but part of you, part of your spiritual journey that needs to be honored instead of fought. Once a week, sit down with paper and pen, write "Dear Solitude" at the top of the page, and then write honestly everything you feel, without editing, without censoring, recognizing the pain, but also recognizing that loneliness has been a tough but true teacher. Then you can burn the letter or keep it. It doesn't matter. What matters is the act of recognition, of making conscious and explicit what normally remains unconscious and denied. The fifth practice is to remain present to others even when your own loneliness is screaming for attention. Because one of the most profound forms of decreation is being able to give your undivided attention to another person even when you are suffering. Being able to really listen to what another is saying instead of constantly being focused on your own pain. And Weil discovered that these moments of attention to the other momentarily dissolve the suffering ego and create space where something different can happen. Not a cure for loneliness, but temporary relief through genuine interest in the existence of another human being. When you are in conversation, notice when your loneliness wants to dominate your attention. Notice when you are just waiting your turn to talk about your pain instead of really listening to the other. And gently, without judgment, return your full attention to the person in front of you. Practice being present despite the pain, and you may find that these moments of true presence with the other are more freeing than any amount of self-obsession with your own spiritual condition. The sixth practice is to accept each day without knowing how it will be, without demanding that the day brings relief or transformation or the presence of God, just consenting to whatever comes, and every morning before knowing whether the day will be painful or tolerable, say internally, "I accept whatever this day brings. I consent to the reality that will unfold." And when the day brings more loneliness, more absence, more silence from God, you remember that you consented, that you chose to accept reality before knowing what it would be. And this changes something subtle in the way you carry the day, because now it is not an unwanted surprise, but something that you had already accepted as a possibility. The seventh practice is to recognize three things before bed. A truth that solitude revealed today. It could be a small truth about yourself, or about the nature of faith, or about how the world works. A moment of something like grace, even if tiny. It could be good conversation, or a moment of beauty, or simply the fact that you survived another day, and a choice you made to stay, to not give up completely, to maintain some openness despite everything. And this nightly recognition is not forced gratitude or artificial optimism, but simply the act of noticing what was real in the day, instead of being consumed only by that hurt. And it is important to know that you will constantly fail in these practices. There will be days where you cannot even remember them. Days where loneliness is so intense that any practice seems impossible or ridiculous. Days where you simply survive without any spiritual dignity, and that is completely fine. Failing to practice is not failure, but part of the process. Weil herself was not able to live perfectly what she taught. She had moments of despair, of bitterness, of revolt against her own condition. And the objective was never perfection, but direction. It is not to eliminate loneliness, but to learn to carry it in a way that preserves something essential within yourself when everything seems to be falling apart. And now, having walked this journey together through the paradoxical loneliness of those who have faith, through the brutal truths that Simone Weil discovered when she refused to escape this loneliness, through the practices that can make coexistence possible even when healing is not, it remains only to recognize what you had the courage to face by watching this video so far. You've made it to the end, and that already says something profound about you, that you're not willing to accept comforting lies about faith, that you have the courage to look at loneliness without needing to immediately transform it into something more palatable, that you belong to that small group of people that Simone Weil would call honest enough to bear the naked truth. Most religious people never admit this loneliness. Live pretending that faith solves everything, that prayer always brings peace, that spiritual community eliminates fundamental isolation. But you are not the majority. You are someone who knows the loneliness that screams inside those who still believe. who knows that faith and abandonment can coexist, who understands that you can love God and feel completely alone at the same time. And if anything in this video resonated with deep truth within you, if you felt like someone was finally naming experience that you carry but can rarely articulate, if any words here touched a wound that you barely admit exists, then leave a like on this video, because it shows me that these words are reaching those who really need them, those who have the courage to be honest about the solitude of faith instead of hiding it under layers of manufactured certainty, and subscribe to the channel as we continue this journey of brutal honesty about what it really means having faith in a world that offers no guarantees, because there are others walking this same difficult path, others who know the same paradoxical loneliness, and you don't have to walk completely alone even when loneliness seems to be all there is. The loneliness you feel is not a defect in your faith. It is a sign that your faith is real and not just manufactured psychological comfort. It is proof that you are touching something genuinely transcendent and not just projecting your human needs onto an empty screen that you call God. Simone Weil discovered that deep within this loneliness, when you completely stop running away from it, when you inhabit it with total attention without trying to change it or explain it or resolve it, something impossible can happen. You don't stop being alone, but you stop being lost. Loneliness turns into solidity, sacred space where you can finally find not the God you wanted, but the God who really exists, not the faith that brings comfort, but the faith that brings truth. And truth is always worth more than comfort, even when it hurts infinitely more. The absence you feel is not God abandoning you, but God respecting you enough to let you be genuinely free, genuinely human, genuinely capable of real choice, rather than a puppet tied to invisible strings of divine manipulation through sensitive rewards and punishments. And perhaps this painful absence is the purest form of divine love, love that does not need constant reciprocity, that does not require you to feel good all the time, that allows you to experience the full range of human emotions, including despair and abandonment, because God understands that without these experiences, you would never grow beyond spiritual infancy. You are not alone on this journey even when loneliness seems to be all there is, because Simone Weil walked this same path 70-odd years ago, lived this same paradoxical loneliness with an intensity that few can imagine, and what she discovered and recorded in notebooks and letters and essays remains true, continues to offer not solace, but something more valuable, offers the company of someone who understands, who doesn't judge you for feeling what they feel, who doesn't offer you easy solutions, but honors you with naked truth about what it really means to have faith in God, who completely transcends our human categories of presence and absence. And now the choice is yours. You can keep fighting loneliness. You can keep demanding that God show up the way you want. You can keep feeling abandoned and resentful of that absence. Or you can do what Weil did. You can accept loneliness completely. You can inhabit it mindfully instead of running away from it. You can allow it to destroy all your illusions about who God should be and make room for the God who really is. And no one can make that choice for you. No one can walk that path in your place. Not even God will intervene to force you to choose, because a forced choice would not be a real choice. Simone Weil lived only 34 years, but in those years, she looked deeper into the loneliness of faith than most people dare in a lifetime. She found no cure for loneliness, but found dignity in it. She found no end to the absence of God, but she found a way to love God through the absence, and not in spite of it. She found no community that eliminated fundamental isolation, but she found a way to exist in isolation without being destroyed by it. And perhaps that is what we all really need, not the elimination of loneliness, but the ability to carry loneliness with truth, with attention, with the kind of love that demands nothing in return, because it has finally understood that God does not exist to satisfy our needs, but we exist to participate in a mystery that transcends us completely. You are not alone on this journey. The loneliness you carry is not unique, even if it seems completely isolated. And the faith you maintain, despite everything, despite the silence, in spite of the absence, despite the pain, this faith is more precious than faith that has never been tested, because it is real, it is honest, it is capable of bearing truth instead of needing comforting lies. Keep looking, keep feeling, Keep believing even when belief hurts more than it comforts, because that's exactly what Simone Weil would do. That's exactly what she did until her last breath, and the path she walked so courageously remains open to you if you have the courage to follow it with no guarantee of reward, no promise of relief, no certainty of anything other than that it will be true, even when truth cuts deeper than any lie ever could.